Welcome to Talking Ukraine in English. This is episode number 1 with our guest, Dr. Alexander Motyl, an American historian and political scientist.
My name is Damian Kolodi, and I'm the creator of this podcast. My background is a documentary filmmaker, and I've made 2 feature-length documentaries about Ukraine over the years. And I've been in and out of the country over the last 20 years in various capacities. For this first episode, let's call it a pilot episode, we're going to have a conversation with Dr. Alexander Motyl. He is a professor of political science at Rutgers University in Newark, New Jersey. He's a specialist on Ukraine, Russia, and the USSR, and he is the author of 7 academic books and a regular contributor to The Hill. Motyl is also the author of 11 novels and a collection of poetry. His artwork has been shown in solo and group shows in New York, Philadelphia, Westport, and Toronto, and is part of the permanent collection of the Ukrainian Museum in New York and the Ukrainian Cultural Center in Winnipeg. I've known Alex for many years as we've crossed paths in the diaspora in New York, and I've seen him speak at many conferences and panels. And I really enjoy getting his insight and observations. I find him to be a very thoughtful and articulate speaker. So this is really great to have him here for this first pilot episode of this podcast. We covered a lot of topics in our conversation, starting with the American elections, and then moving on to situation in Europe and the recent elections there, where the far right has gained popularity, and then talking about, more specifically Russia and Ukraine. So we cover a lot in this podcast, probably a little bit longer than the future ones will be, but I think it's for anyone who wants to do a deeper dive. There's a lot of valuable information and insight here. So I'm going to keep it at the length that it is. I hope you can enjoy it and share it with others and you find it beneficial. Thank you for checking it out and spending your time here.
And here we are in the first episode of Talking Ukraine in English with Dr. Alexander Motyl. We wanted to start out talking about Zelensky's recent trip to the United States. How was he received at the UN in general? What was your sense?
Well, he's no longer the darling of the world. He's become a regular policymaker who supports a good cause. But again, he doesn't quite have that star quality that he had 2 or 3 years ago. But that said, it's just back to normal. I mean, one can't sustain star quality. I mean, according to Andy Warhol, for more than 15 minutes, he managed to do it for at least 15 months. So that's pretty good. As you know, there was a whole bunch of controversy regarding his visit. Yeah. He visited a munitions plant in Pennsylvania, was photographed together with their Democratic governor. This led a variety of Republicans to claim that he had interfered in the American electoral process. The Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, demanded that Ukraine's ambassador to Washington, Oksana Markarova, be removed. Trump got a hissy fit and canceled his meeting with Zelensky, but at the end of the day, the meeting did take place, and lo and behold, the insults pretty much stopped. That's not to say that relations with Trump are now ideal, but they're no longer quite as hostile as they were just a few days ago. At the same time, he met with Kamala Harris, who was very supportive of Ukraine. He met with Joe Biden, who expressed, again, very strong support of Ukraine. Whether that support, the verbal support, will morph into actual ammunition and weapons is, of course, the question. And we'll see what happens after November's elections. But all in all, the meeting was probably, I'd say, was satisfactory from Zelensky's point of view. he had an opportunity to present his victory plan. I'm not sure that American policymakers bought into it, but I don't think that was the intent. The idea behind this was simply to remind them, as well as Ukraine's allies in the West, that there is a way for Ukraine to win, and it entails more weapons of various kinds for Ukraine. So if the West wants Ukraine to win, it can and will win. So it's all, the ball is in the West's court.
And I guess it's still sort of a question what stance Harris will take in supporting Ukraine, whether she will continue sort of Biden's, well, let's not let Ukraine die approach, but let's not give them enough to win, or whether she might actually step it up and give them a little more to fight back with.
Well, for what it's worth, I mean, she did say, we will support you until you prevail, which is social scientese for until you win. Biden said something pretty much to the same effect. Of course, they've been saying something like that for the last 2.5 years, so it's not exactly clear what this all means. But the point is, when you compare what they say to what Vance and Trump say, there's no question that Harris and Biden are at least verbally more supportive of Zelensky and of Ukraine. And one could probably expect her, if she becomes president, at the very least to continue with Biden's policies. It's conceivable that she may actually want to up the ante, provide more weapons in a more timely fashion in order to differentiate herself from Biden. Again, it's possible. It's also possible that she won't. We don't know. We simply don't know. But it would be an opportunity for her to show that she's a tough leader. Because, of course, if Harris wins, the first thing that the Republicans will say, as they're saying already, is that she's a weak leader. She's essentially a Casper milquetoast, a pushover, in contrast to Donald Trump, who is strong and will make sure that Putin and everybody else follows his will. So she'll have to, demonstrate in some fashion that she's her own person, her own woman, that she can't be kicked around, that she's tough. And it might just be the case that supporting Ukraine more than at present might be the way that she decides to illustrate her toughness and demonstrate that she's perfectly up for the job. But we don't know.
Yeah. Well, Trump seemed to speak more about Ukraine in the last week than he has all year. He's mentioned it in some comments at some rallies, pretty disparagingly. But then he met with Zelensky, and he had a kind of a different tone. You wrote an article, "The Real Reason Trump Hates Zelensky," recently. What was your take from that article, and what did your opinion change after their meeting, or what? I felt that meeting was pretty awkward. Watching
the meeting was
video.
awkward. I mean, I think, the meeting had to take place, and as humiliating as it must have been for Zelensky, because, of course, Trump purposefully, repeatedly insulted and humiliated him. But Zelensky, being the weaker president, simply has no alternative but to go hat in hand to Trump and to Harris and to Biden and anybody else who will listen. So the fact that the meeting took place was positive. The fact that they didn't come out fighting is also good. Is it going to change Trump's attitudes? Probably not. First of all, we don't even know what his real attitudes are, but based on what he's been saying on Ukraine, he's clearly no Ukraine supporter. What's striking to me in his attitude towards Zelensky is the degree to which he continually, purposefully, consistently insults him. And he insults him by referring to him as a salesman.
I see Zelensky is here. I think Zelensky is the greatest salesman in history. Every time he comes into the country, he walks away with $60 billion. Billion! Walks in with $60 billion. He wants them to win this election so badly. But I would do differently. I will work out peace as president-elect. If I win this election, the first thing I'm going to do is call up Zelensky and call up President Putin, and I'm going to say, you got to make a deal. This is crazy.
Now, there are two issues I'd like to underline here. One is Trump thinks of himself as the world's greatest deal maker. A deal maker is basically a salesman, and a salesman is a deal maker. There is no fundamental distinction. The difference is that a deal maker sounds positive, where a salesman sounds like some kind of shyster who's trying to rip you off, right? So we refer to used car salesmen, vacuum cleaner salesmen. We don't refer to used car deal makers, even though that's what they are, right? And it seems to me that what's going on here is that Trump feels threatened by Zelensky because, of course, there's only one room for the best deal maker in the world. And if he's the best deal maker, that must mean that Zelensky is the best salesman. I suspect there's something else going on here as well. Because, of course, the image of the shyster salesman who's ripping off innocent buyers is anti-Semitism 101, right? I mean, that's the traditional image, anti-Semitic image of Jews, right? They are the salesmen who will always sell you the inferior product in order to rip you off. And my guess is that, wittingly or not, Trump is appealing to that particular tendency within his electorate. We know that his electorate isn't exactly the most enlightened, the most liberal in its views, and it's not inconceivable that this kind of language, this kind of image resonates with them. Maybe not consciously, maybe it's unconscious. And of course, the fact that Zelensky happens to be Jewish obviously helps. And everybody knows that. So by invoking the cheating salesman, Trump is effectively saying, look at this Jewish president. He's nothing more than a cheat and a liar who's trying to rip us all off. That's a very sad commentary on Trump. It's also a very sad commentary on his electorate. And ultimately, it's a sad commentary on American democracy because he's getting away with this. He's not being called out on this. And he should be. Trump should be denounced for using this kind of imagery. And I haven't encountered any denunciations. Maybe I haven't read everything that's been available. That's also true.
Well, it seems like Trump almost has this immunity at this point. People are so desensitized and used to his abrasive way, and that, he just cares about himself and getting all the attention for himself. And that's sort of why some people love him, I guess. But it seems like that's become acceptable in the political world, where, before you had Howard Dean make some weird mannerism, and then he lost his whole campaign, years ago. But it seems like, Trump has changed, what's become acceptable in the public sphere.
You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right.
So there's a significant portion of the Ukrainian diaspora that continues to support Trump, which to me is hard to understand. I'm wondering if you have any insights about that. It seems to be, people who were second generation, maybe of your generation, who grew up Republican, conservative, because Republicans historically were always anti-communism, and so they've been lifelong Republicans, and they just seem to project what they would like Trump to be supporting Ukraine, but it's not and connect with reality, but they still sort of like are reaching out to support Trump and can't, face this reality that Trump is not as good for Ukraine as the Democratic Party candidate has been. Like, have you, come across that? Do you have any like explanations of like what's going? Have you had
I follow
conversations?
I follow some of those threads up to a point, and then I gag. But so I am sort of familiar with the logic. I mean, one point that they consistently make is that in contrast to Obama, blah, 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 Trump gave Ukraine javelins. And again, that's supposed to suggest that he will therefore support Ukraine in its war against Russia, despite the fact that there's so much overwhelming evidence that he and Vance detest Ukraine, detest Zelensky, and have absolutely no interest in the Ukrainian victory. I mean, it's just screamingly obvious. A couple of months ago, one could arguably say, well, the evidence is a little mixed. Who knows? But now Trump has made it absolutely clear, and of course, Vance has made it even clearer, that neither of them has any particular love for Ukraine. And yet the Ukrainian Americans who support Trump, they managed to wiggle out of these obvious statements of antipathy towards Ukraine, and they look for some kind of saving grace. We ultimately, because he's unpredictable, he will act in Ukraine's best interest because he's really smart after all. Well, that may all be true. It's just that nothing that he said suggests that that's the way he's going to behave. So basically what you're saying is that, well, there's a chance that we'll roll the dice and get a deuce. Well, that's certainly true, but more likely you'll get a 7 or a 6 or a 5. You're not going to get snake eyes. That's hardly, that's the real risk, as everybody who knows anything about probability will tell you. I think the issue is this, however. Trump represents two things for Ukrainian Americans, as well, for everybody, but especially for Ukrainian Americans. There is Trump and his position vis-a-vis Ukraine, and then there is Trump and his positions vis-a-vis America. And his position vis-a-vis America is, some would call it authoritarian, some would call it opposed to wokeism, right? One can call that position any number of things, but it's a separate position from that which he takes vis-a-vis Ukraine. And many of the Ukrainian Americans who support Trump, they face something in the nature of a dilemma. They support him because they are cultural conservatives, as Trump and Vance claim to be. So they're opposed to diversity promotion, they're opposed to wokeism, they're opposed to the so-called left-wing communist agenda that Harris presumably has, right? So there's all of that. There's the cultural conservatism that appeals to this segment of the Ukrainian Americans who support Trump. And then they face a dilemma because they truly believe in cultural conservatism. And at the same time, I'm betting that at least a significant portion of them are not so incapable of understanding the English language as to misread Trump's statements on Ukraine. I mean, he's pretty obvious. He doesn't mince his words. He does not care about Ukraine. But since the cultural conservatism is as important, if not more important, that then leads them to look for of backhanded, convoluted explanations of why Trump really is pro-Ukrainian, even though it's obvious from his statements that he's not. In contrast, the Ukrainians who oppose Trump on Ukraine, generally, not always, so they don't have this anguished dilemma. You can oppose Trump's cultural conservatism. I don't mean you personally, but one can oppose his cultural conservatism. And that's perfectly consistent with opposing his policy towards Ukraine. The other side is, as it were, rent by this contradiction. And since the cultural conservatism is so obviously important to them, there's this one woman who continually invokes God and says that God is directing Trump's work and activity. Well, if you're going to invoke God, you're clearly, let's call it, on the culturally conservative side. And that creates a dilemma. And they try to, and in as much as they can't give up the cultural conservatism, that leads them to certain semi-plausible, semi-implausible explanation for why Trump behaves as he does vis-a-vis Ukraine.
Yeah. That to me, it's almost, I mean, it's very cultish. It's just like a cult of personality around Trump, and he is the Messiah and he can do no wrong, which, like I voted for Obama, but I could be like, I didn't like he did this, and that was good, and that was good. I'm not like all in but for them, it seems like
Yeah.
you're either all in for Trump and there, and that's it. You can't be like, well, I like that he did this. They're like either all in or not. And
Or all
that's,
out. And I think you're right. I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, there is that cult of personality quality to Trump. I mean, his supporters, they deify him. He can do no wrong. And I mean, we've seen that over the last 8 years, regardless of whichever scandal he gets involved in, he can do no wrong. It's just remarkable. In contrast to everybody else, I mean, Zelensky goes innocently wanders into a munitions factory in Pennsylvania, and he immediately gets excoriated for interfering in the electoral process. I mean, good Lord, seriously? I mean, that's just making a mountain out of a molehill. And in contrast, Trump insults, humiliates people, and not just Zelensky, on a daily basis. He acts like a buffoon, and people love it. He's their guy. He's their man. More than that, he's their prophet. And that, of course, is the scary part about all of this, because democracy doesn't really deal well with uh, populist prophets. It requires, a certain degree of thought. It requires a certain degree of moderation, a willingness to listen, a willingness to admit mistakes. That's what makes democracy tick. If you come in and claim that you are the second Messiah, then you're in a very different political system. It's certainly not democracy anymore.
yeah, I think this election is going to be, regardless of who wins, is not going to be smooth result either way. So it's going to be kind of a very precarious situation, post-election day, personally.
I agree with you. It's a very scary prospect. I mean, if Trump wins, the Harris supporters are likely to take to the streets. If Trump loses, even if, regardless of the margin, his supporters are likely to take to the streets. And of course, the problem is that Harris will at least admit to having lost.
Right.
And so conceivably, she might be able to quiet down her supporters. Trump, of course, by definition, cannot lose. So if he loses, it must have been as a result of fraud, which will simply mobilize his supporters even more. And he's not going to stop them. He's not going to tell them you shouldn't do this. Quite the opposite. He'll say, of course, you've got to protest because the election has been stolen once again.
Yeah.
And then what do you do? Who knows?
Yeah. Who knows? Who knows? Maybe let's switch to Europe. Europe's had some elections with the recent elections in Germany with the Alternative for Democracy.
Alternative for Germany.
Yeah, for Germany, of getting more power, and Austria and some of these other countries. So there's a tendency for these groups to be more pro-Russian. Why do you think this is happening? Is Russia, at play in influencing these elections?
Well, I mean, it's clearly the case that Russia has been spending billions of dollars on social media and information disinformation, and they've been focusing on Germany. I mean, they have a very high presence in Austria. I believe the largest number of Russian spies are in Austria. So I'm sure it's the case that their money, their influence, the people that they've been able to buy, the people who serve as their agents of influence have had something to do with the march forward of the right in Europe. But obviously, it's not just that. Um, it's, you know, I mean, lots of people believe that Viktor Orban, the prime minister of Hungary, is on Russia's payroll. Others claim that that the Russians have some kind of compromising materials on him and that they're blackmailing him. That's perfectly possible. But it's also possible that he, like Robert Fico in Slovakia, like Kikel, the head of the Freedom Party in Austria, then there's that fellow who's the head of the Alternative for Germany. There's Marine Le Pen in France. There's also right-wing movements in the Netherlands and other European countries, including Italy. And I think a lot of that has to do with what they claim, namely that there's a genuine problem with immigration or refugees. People are distraught, and that's true in this country as well. And they're distraught not simply because they're fascists and hate refugees, but because there are lots of refugees. And it's beginning to strain the social system. It has a potentially complicated impact on people's perceptions and identities. You know, are you still living in Germany, or is Germany becoming Turkey? And when did that happen? You know, did I make that decision? No, someone seems to have made it for me. And again, there's obviously an element of xenophobia here. That goes without saying. But there's also an element of genuine discontent. People are confused. People don't know whether their countries are their countries anymore. They're not sure whether integration is working, whether diversity is working. And there's evidence to suggest that it does and does not work. So you can draw on any number of studies or experts to make a case for that or some other point of view. And this is where sort of democratic forces have lapsed. You know, they should have realized that immigration is a concern for people. The people may be wrong. Maybe they should have been responding in a more Christian, open manner, but they are who they are. And if you want to prevent the right wing from attracting this vote, you've got to do something to neutralize the appeal of the right by making certain kinds of concessions. None of this is easy. It's extremely difficult, but it needs to be addressed. And Democrats have, by and large, they haven't quite addressed it in the manner that they should. And the result is that you've got parties in Germany, Austria, Slovakia, Hungary, Italy, France, all over the place, making serious political hay on the basis of claims that immigration should be reversed. All of the immigrants have got to be thrown out. And of course, that too is already, you know, that's unacceptable morally, probably impossible politically. But in terms of electoral politics, it really resonates. People like simple solutions to complicated problems. And the populists come in and say, we're going to throw them all out. And then everything will be back to the way it used to be when you were young. Well, that ain't going to happen. But it sounds like a very attractive proposition.
I think also, you know, since the Israel-Palestine war has amplified that there's a lot more Arab people protesting in these European countries, or acting out, sometimes violently, where it's fueled those flames of fear of immigrants and tribalism and all that.
I mean, Germany is especially in a pickle because, its legacy during World War II, its responsibility for the Holocaust, and Germany has been very careful about trying to craft a particular national identity that incorporates responsibility for the Holocaust as a core element of that identity. And, that does not work. My understanding from a number of German students that I've talked to is that they're not fully persuaded that they are responsible. After all, they weren't even born in that period of time.
Yeah.
And then things get even more complicated if you're talking about Palestinians or Syrians who have an axe to grind against the Israelis, rightly or wrongly, and then feel that they are the ones who are being victimized as opposed to being the victimizers. And again, they may be right, they may be wrong, but the reality is that they are there. They have these feelings, and these feelings do have an impact on politics within Germany. And how do you deal with this? Again, I don't really know.
What's another interesting angle is that there's a lot of Russians in Germany, and Germans, as far as I understand it, have felt a little bit of post-World War II guilt towards Russians, and have maybe taken an extra step to try to build good relations with them because of the atrocities that they committed against the Russians during World War II. Weirdly enough, most of the atrocities they committed at that time were against Ukrainians when they conquered Ukraine, but they don't seem to have like this feeling of like, well, we owe Ukraine for all the suffering that we caused them. And many Ukrainians fought at that time for the Soviet army as well. But that's something that, they have this guilt about Russia, but it doesn't transfer somehow to Ukraine. Ukraine is not part of that equation for some reason.
Absolutely right. The Germans occupied a very small portion of Russia. They occupied essentially all of Ukraine. Most severe battles took place in Ukraine. The German policy within Ukraine was largely destructive, genocidal, not only towards Jews, but also towards the Roma, the Ukrainians, the Poles. You would think that there'd be some appreciation of the fact that there's this country called Ukraine, which happened to be ravaged by the German army and the SS for several years in World War II. It's beginning to dawn on them. I mean, a number of intellectuals, a number of professors, journalists, and others do emphasize this fact. But overall, the German attitude towards the war is still that it was a Russlandkrieg, a Russia war. And the enemy was the Russians. And the Ukrainians are just kind of missing in this picture. And that goes back, again, this is a deeper problem, arguably hundreds of years. Germany always had this obsession with Russia. Russia had an obsession with Germany. The Baltic Germans were a kind of funnel for these obsessions. And Ukraine was just this place where lots of wheat grew, but it didn't have an identity. It didn't have an essence to it. It was just a place that you drove your tanks across in order to kill Jews or Russians or whomever that you were out to kill. So, emblematic of this, I mean, back in I think it's 1947 or 48, Heinrich Böll, the famous German writer who won a Nobel Prize, he passed away some 10 or so years ago, wrote a novella, Der Zug hält pünktlich, the train stops punctually. And it's about a German soldier who's on the front in Ukraine, and he gets a furlough back home in Germany. And then the novel itself concerns his trip back to the front, in which the key character returns to Ukraine, to the front in southern Ukraine. And on the way, he's looking at a map and identifying all sorts of Ukrainian towns and cities that he'll be passing through. That said, not once does the novel or the soldier mention Ukraine or Ukrainians or Ruthenians or anything like that. All he does is mention peasants. And here you have a classic example of this blind spot, written by a writer, Heinrich Böll, who was very much a liberal. He was a good guy. He atoned for the Holocaust. I mean, again, he has all the nice credentials, and yet it doesn't occur to him even once to mention the fact that this guy is returning to Ukraine and the battlefield in Ukraine. So we're talking about a serious blind spot. I mean, imagine if a writer in the United States in the 1930s were traveling in the Deep South and didn't mention even once the African American population. Not even once. He doesn't have to like them, but he could at least point to an African American walking down the street and chewing gum.
Yeah.
But Heinrich Böll doesn't mention Ukrainians even once. And that is, again, very typical, unfortunately, for many Germans still. Now, again, things have changed. There's a war going on. The policymaking elites have changed their positions. But this was a key problem for so many years, and it still is. The other component in Germany, which is the problem, is the Social Democrats. The Socialist Party has, for the last few decades, except for the last 2 years, been very much Putin-friendly, pro-Putin, pro-Russian, and completely indifferent to Ukraine. And emblematic of that is the former Chancellor Gerhard Schröder, who, as you know, served something like, was it 10 years, I believe, as Chancellor. And then he, immediately after his second term in office, he gets a position on the board of directors, if I'm not mistaken, of Gazprom, taking a position with Joseph Goebbels or something. That's essentially the same thing. I mean, and here's a man who should know better, and yet he believes that working for Gazprom, an institution that is partly responsible for the end of democracy and the political repressions instituted by Putin, he sees nothing wrong with this. And as a matter of fact, as I'm sure you know, during the Orange Revolution, when there was a fear of a Russian invasion of Ukraine, it was Gerhard Schröder who said that Putin is a crystal clear Democrat. I mean, of all things. I mean, you can call Putin many things, but to call him a crystal clear Democrat requires some degree of either blindness or stupidity or collaboration.
Well, he's on the payroll.
I lean towards, he's basically on the payroll.
I mean, he's making huge money with his relationship to Russia.
So it's only now that the socialists have, under Scholz, I mean, that they've changed their position. They support Ukraine. They don't support it as much as they could support it, as they should support it. But the mere fact that they have been providing Ukraine with financial and military assistance is already a remarkable development. I mean, if Schröder was still in power, he'd probably be providing helicopters to the Russian army.
They've provided for a lot of refugees that came to Ukraine, but their military assistance has been lacking in what they could do.
Yeah, but at least, a few Leopards, a few planes. It's something when you consider the fact that Ukraine didn't even exist as far as they were concerned a number of years ago. So this is almost earth-shattering.
But what's your take where the war is now? It's 2.5 years since the full invasion. Since 2014 was sort of like the hybrid invasion. I mean, when it first happened, I think people expected that Russia would quickly win, and we're getting almost to year 3 now. Ukraine has, I think, exceeded expectations, but they've lost tremendous amount of people, and Russia's and Putin's tactics of terrorizing the civilization are working. I was there this summer, and people are tired of losing people they know, of electricity not working, of the economy being unpredictable, and people are tired. Like these tactics of terrorizing and killing civilians, are finally like taking a toll. I don't know, like, what's your take, maybe like from your first reaction to when the invasion started to like where we are today? Where
Well,
are we today?
let me put my cards on the table. I did not expect a war. I was one of the few who, until the very end, thought that to start a war against Ukraine would be complete and total idiocy on Putin's part.
I thought the same thing. I'm like, there's no way he's going to open the door like that,
Yeah.
because even
And
if you yeah.
and again, on the one hand, we were wrong because obviously he did, but at the same time, we were right because the things that we predicted, namely a very long war, alienation of the West, mobilization of NATO, collapse of the Russian economy, huge casualties. I mean, all of those things are things that I continually pointed to in saying Putin isn't stupid enough to begin a war that will have precisely the consequences that he doesn't want. Well, he proved stupid enough to do that, but we proved, I think, farsighted enough to have realized what the consequences would be. And they are exactly what we thought they'd be. The Russian economy is a complete mess, and in 2025 is likely to experience an extremely severe crisis. Russia's lost over 600,000 men. At some point that becomes unsustainable. There has to be, we know that there is criticism of Putin within the government, within the political and economic elites. Um, you know, the fact that they keep on invoking nuclear weapons, I think, is more than anything else indicative of the desperation they feel. They're not doing well in the battlefield. They're advancing incrementally near Pokrovsk. They've lost a good part of Kursk Oblast. They've lost the Black Sea. The Kerch Bridge is likely to be attacked and destroyed in the next few weeks or months. When you look at this in its entirety, this war has been a disaster for Putin and for Russia. It's obviously also been a disaster for Ukraine. I don't want to minimize the horror, but we shouldn't forget that it is as much, and I would argue actually more of a disaster for Russia. So my own view here is that as tired as Ukrainians are, they know by and large that there really isn't much of an alternative. I mean, the choice is between fighting and suicide, which isn't terribly appealing to anybody. Now, at some point, Ukrainians may begin to think in terms of negotiating a ceasefire and temporarily granting Russia a continued occupation of its territories. That moment has not yet arrived, but it might arrive. I mean, we don't know. Much, of course, depends on the West. I mean, if the West ups its supplies of ammunitions, weapons, and so on, Ukraine can push the Russians out of many, if not most, of the occupied territories. I'm sure of that. I don't know about all the territories, but certainly they could probably push them out of Zaporizhia and Kherson and possibly do a kibosh on Crimea. But that depends on the West. If the West wants Ukraine to win, or at least win to a certain degree, Ukraine will win to a certain degree.
But
If the
it
West
seems like
doesn't want it,
yeah, I was going to say, it seems like they don't want Ukraine to win. Win in the fact that like Russia might uh, fall apart in the sense that it might break up in the makeup that it is now, or that they're
that's the
afraid
fear.
that these nuclear weapons maybe might fall into the hands of some warlords or something like
Yeah,
that.
that's the fear. So if Ukraine wins too much, there's a potential for some kind of crisis, and then who knows what happens. The problem is that that particular view, in other words, the policy that the United States and Europe are currently pursuing, of providing Ukraine with just enough to keep the front more or less stable, to weaken Russia. Again, everybody wants a weak Russia. They just don't want a dead Russia, but definitely a weak Russia. So Ukraine is playing the role of weakening Russia. It's paying the price, of course, and the West is garnering the benefit. But the irony is the following. Because of the catastrophic condition of Russia's army and economy, the longer the war drags on in this fashion, the more likely will Russia actually collapse. This is the irony. The United States and its allies are actually promoting Russia's collapse. They think they are saving it from collapse. In reality, they're promoting this collapse. And they're doing so by dragging out the war. Everybody keeps on saying time is on Russia's side. That's not true. Time is not on Russia's side, and 2025 is likely to be crunch time for the Russian
But
economy and military.
but I've heard that said before, that Russia economy is going to implode, that the sanctions are going to impact them. And it doesn't seem like that's happened. Like their economy is moving. They seem to have an endless amount of personnel and people and cannon fodder to just, people are still signing up to go. They still have rockets and bombs, like as much, as their arsenal has been decimated, they're still out, like they're still coming out with more and they're still
Yeah.
making these slow advances in territory. I mean, it's coming at a huge cost, but for Putin doesn't care. For him, it's worth it. I mean, it doesn't seem like it seems like to him any cost is worth it, but the economy's shifted to a war economy and it's still going. So I sort of remember hearing that, in the first year, okay, like Russia is not going to be able to maintain this, but they, I'm surprised they are still going as much as they are. Like that their war machine is just still seems to be,
Well,
moving.
there are a number of Russian opposition economists who are respectable, serious economists who use Russian statistics. My favorite of them is a guy by the name of Vladimir Milov, M-I-L-O-V. He speaks in Russian. I think he lives in Berlin and heads some kinds of institute. But he makes it extremely clear that the Russian economy is tanking. People in the West keep on pointing to the 3.5% GDP growth. Almost all of that actually, is due to the fact that Putin is taking money that he doesn't really have and pumping it into the war economy. In contrast, the civilian economy, the one that consumers faced, is experiencing negative growth. Now, this is based on Russian statistics. These are not, made up or anything like that. The result of that is that there is insufficient supply of consumer goods to meet popular demand. And according to estimates made by an independent think tank, inflation in Russia officially is about 8%, which is very high, and they don't know how to end it. But unofficially, with regard to these consumer goods is closer to 22%. People's pensions are no longer able to meet people's needs. And the problem, the dilemma, the crisis that the Russian economy is very likely to face next year is stagflation, namely very low growth with very high inflation. Very hard to cure that. Now, Putin doesn't care because all he wants is to have his economy, his military economy grow. But that depends on his being able to draw on resources, on budgetary resources, which means either you print money. If you print money, that leads to hyperinflation, so that doesn't work, or else you raise taxes, which simply leads to, I mean, again, you can get the money, but that leads to a decline in production and to increased bankruptcies of medium and small businesses. So Putin has maneuvered the system into a genuine dead end. And according to Milov and others, next year will be a decisive year for the Russian economy. Putin is running out of money. He can't fund the economy, the war, at the current rates with the resources he has. The economy is tanking. And unless the Russians are different from everybody else in all of human history, they will feel the economic pain and will sooner or later begin to express some forms of discontent. So the situation economically is far, far, far worse than many people in the West believe. Then when you come to the soldiers, according to the recent data published by Ukrainian sources, it's 625,000 Russian soldiers are dead and wounded. The Wall Street Journal estimates 200,000 dead, 400,000 wounded. This is astounding. The usual ratio for dead to wounded is 1 to 3 or 1 to 4. But the Russian ratio is 1 to 2, which means that if you're wounded, they don't care. Your chances of survival are close to zero because they basically don't care. We know from accounts of deserters, we know from accounts of POWs, the conditions within the Russian army are absolutely dreadful. I've seen videos of sergeants and lieutenants, I mean, literally beating their soldiers in order to make them comply. That kind of army will not be able to sustain a prolonged slog. Now, it's done so already, so obviously you can do a lot of things with coercion. But the more the economy begins to tank, the greater the degree of popular discontent. And more importantly, the greater the belief on the part of Russia's political and economic elites that Putin is driving the country into the toilet. I mean, put yourself in the position of a Russian oligarch, or for that matter, a Russian general or someone in the FSB, the Secret Service. And you remember that 3 years ago, you had this hyper-powerful army that looked invincible. And now it's a joke. And it's falling apart before your very eyes. If you're an oligarch, the economy is falling apart before your very eyes. You lost millions of dollars. You were able to vacation on the Riviera. Now it's North Korea. Okay? So my own view, and again, it's not just my own view. I happen to, it's mirrored by a whole bunch of Russians, is that this regime is actually very weak, that Putin is far weaker than we think he is. And all it'll take is some kind of shock to the system. Or it could just be an incidental atrocity. Remember a number of years ago when the Iranians took to the streets, that was because a young woman had been killed by the secret police. Politically insignificant, but it outraged people, and for months they demonstrated. Something like that could easily, very, very easily happen in Russia as well.
Well, I feel like the Russian people support the war overwhelmingly. That the Russian propaganda, especially within Russia, is so successful and convincing them, like of these Nazis in Ukraine, that NATO's at fault, and they're just defending their motherland or whatever. I've seen so many of these videos, and all these casualties and deaths, and people are still signing up to go there, to go to the front, or maybe they're told they're not going to go to the front, but they're signing up anyway because it's a good salary.
I
I'm
agree.
skeptical. I'm skeptical of like some sort of like discontent because of the economy, like causing a change. But I think what you wrote in your article, there's something rotten about the Russian soul, where they like war, they like this death, they get off on it. It's part of their society, violence. And the only way to really make change in that type of society is for them to have a crushing defeat, or a significant enough defeat where that would be like the catalyst for some sort of change, more so than any economic discontent. I mean, that's
Yeah. No, I agree with you on that, by the way. My point about economic discontent was simply that it weakens the regime. It weakens
yeah.
Putin, it weakens legitimacy. It makes disagreement and discontent possible to express conceivably. All these factors, in other words, they just weaken the regime. So I think, a spark of some kind can do the trick. I mean, it's done the trick in other societies in the past. More likely than not, it'll be discontent, not so much on the part of the masses, because you can always kick some butt and people will shut up. But it'll be powerful elites, possibly some generals, possibly some oligarchs. We shouldn't downplay the possibility of a coup d'etat. Russian history, going back centuries, is full of coups. Soviet history is full of coups. I mean, Stalin basically seized power from Lenin. Khrushchev seized power from Stalin, and in the process eliminated his rivals. Brezhnev overthrew Khrushchev. Gorbachev was pretty much overthrown by Yeltsin. I mean, the process by means of which Yeltsin came to power was not exactly legal. Yeltsin was essentially removed by a cabal led by the oligarch Boris Berezovsky, and they put Putin in his place, thinking like the German elites in 1933, that if we put Hitler in charge, we'll be able to control the guy. And then remember last year there was what's his name, Yevgeny
Prigozhin.
Prigozhin, who launched. I mean, people call it a mutiny, call it a mutiny, call it a coup, call it whatever, but it was obviously intended to cause some serious trouble. Um, so if you look back at Russian history, coups and the illegal replacement of leaders by their competitors are actually the norm.
But the current regime is like the former KGB guys. They're the ones controlling it, right? They're the ones, like Putin's been part of their cabal or society or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
They're the organized crime family. It's like this former KGB apparatus. So for, I don't see them grooming someone else. So I just want to kind of curious what you think about this whole thing. Where sometimes we hear about Putin doubles, like
Yeah.
maybe the real Putin is already gone and they're just using doubles, and they're controlling him, or if he does die, or they still have these doubles where they can keep his image alive, right? Like, and keep themselves in power.
That's the theory that's propounded by the Russian professor Valery Solovey. He argued all of last year that Putin was very, very ill, and he's claimed that Putin died on I believe it's October 29th at 9:10 p.m., and that his body is being kept in a cooler in one of the bunkers. At first glance, that sounds totally implausible. He agrees, but says that Russia is a phantasmagorical country, quote unquote, and that anything is possible. Well, I guess so. The point is, however, that if it's the real Putin, he's acting consistently with himself. If this is Putin's double, the person we see attending all these meetings and giving speeches, he's acting consistently with the real Putin. So in a way, it almost doesn't matter whether it's the real Putin or not the real Putin, because he's doing exactly the same thing that the real Putin would have done. So I'm a little skeptical. I'm very skeptical about this. It's an interesting theory. I would love it to be true. I'm not sure that it is, but you never know. Russia is indeed a phantasmagorical place, and it's not inconceivable that something like this could happen. Now, Putin, everybody pretty much agrees that he does have at least one double. But the double seems to be the guy who they send to some nighttime rally where his face is kind of in shadows. But you don't necessarily send the double to negotiate with Xi Jinping in China.
Right.
That just doesn't make any sense. I mean, you would send the real Putin to that. You might send the double to negotiate with, oh, I don't know, pick some small insignificant country.
One more topic that I wanted to talk to you about is going, going on. There's been a lot of talk of, especially from Ukrainians, that Russians are conducting a genocide against Ukrainians in the way that ostensibly Putin initially went in to, free the Russian-speaking population from Ukrainian oppression and liberate these cities, but they destroy, kill, torture, and decimate, Russian-speaking Ukrainians. And Ukrainians are calling this a genocide, but it seems like there's a lot of people in the West who don't want to use that word and apply it to what's going on in Ukraine for some reason. And I don't understand why there's this sort of hesitation. If that's not genocide, then what is genocide? I mean, why is there sort of like this even debate, about whether Russia's conducting genocide against Ukraine?
Well, there's always a debate about everything. So that's part of the answer to your question. No one ever agrees completely about anything. So I think the issue here is it a genocide? I mean, I've been arguing that it's a genocide pretty much from day one. I can show you the articles from March of 2022. And it was clear to me that this was going to go in a genocidal direction. And it's clear that it is a genocide because, I mean, essentially a genocide is the intentional mass murder of a significant portion of a population. Is the killing taking place murder? Yes, it is. Is it mass? Yes, it is. Is it intentional? Yes, it is. To me, that's perfectly clear. It's not as immediately clear to some other people. The argument was made earlier in the war, well, maybe the rockets strayed too far. They were misfired. Well, that's become hard to argue nowadays with the greater accuracy of these rockets. Some people say, well, it's not really a genocide, it's really war, and there's a difference between war and genocide. Okay. I guess there is a bit of a difference between the two, but that doesn't preclude the possibility that they can both be taking place simultaneously, right? I think the main obstacle isn't so much conceptual, it's political. Once you call something a genocide, you're sort of obligated to do something about it, which is why the West always pussyfooted around calling the Rwandan genocide a genocide. Because again, according to UN documents, there is an implied obligation. So if you call Russia genocidal and its policies genocidal, that then doesn't leave you too much room for doing the kinds of things the West likes doing, taking its time, negotiating, trying to find a third way, those sorts of things. Genocide pretty much closes off those soft options. It says, look, you're dealing with essentially the equivalent of Nazi Germany, and there's really only a way to deal with Nazi Germany, and that is by force. And as much as many Westerners still have this illusion that you could negotiate with Putin, if you could just sit down at a table, you could work things out, to call it a genocide would essentially mean that you're negotiating with a genocidal perpetrator. And that would be impermissible. So I think that's the backhanded explanation for why the term hasn't quite caught on. On the other hand, people do refer to Putin's policies as imperialistic. That was a term that people in the West very cautiously avoided. And I've seen on more than one occasion people refer to Putin's regime as fascist. So, 2 out of 3 is pretty good. When you consider that 3 years ago, no one would have used any of those terms to describe Russia.
In the general sphere of the conversation, the global conversation, certainly, people have had to choose a side or see Russia for what it is, which is just a terrorist country.
And of course, unfortunately, many countries, many elites refuse to do that. So they dilly-dally, they pretend things aren't as bad. They don't call it a war. They don't call it a genocide. They call it a crisis, which is, sort of a convenient way of suggesting, well, it's not really that bad. It's just a crisis.
I think people have become desensitized to it, like general civilians, they've been bombarded with all these images and,
that's part of it. That's part of it.
The
It's
human suffering
remarkable.
has been lost.
Yeah. I mean, it's remarkable that the war was in the headlines for about 1.5 years until the Israeli-Palestinian war. And it was pretty much, front page news. Zelensky's was everybody's darling. And that's unprecedented. I can't think of any crisis or problem or event that occupied the media to such a degree for such a long period of time. But then it was pretty much inevitable. I mean, stuff happens, right? There's Israel, there's Palestine, there's Black Lives Matter, there's the latest scandal, there's this, that, and everything else. And the outrage that people felt when the invasion began, it's not that people are no longer outraged, it's just that they're also outraged by other things. So you can only allot so much time and effort to your outrages. And you can see that in American towns. Back in early 2022, there are lots of flags flying all over New York and various towns. Now, Ukrainian flags.
Right.
Now, once in a while, you encounter a flag.
Well, it seems like next year will be a decisive year, potentially.
Looks like it. As you said, Ukrainians are getting tired, but so are Russians. The Russian economy is going to tank. The military is going to keep on losing soldiers. And if the West keeps on supporting Ukraine, Ukraine may just come out of this victorious.
Maybe we should have another conversation after the elections in November.
Yeah, yes. Let's see what happens then.
And see what's
after if and when the American Civil War dies down.
Yeah. Yeah. What is the picture behind you that we're seeing this whole time?
This is a painting I did. It's part of a series called Ukraine in Ruins. And these are acrylics. So this isn't a drawing. And I did these in 2 periods. One was in 2022, and the second set was done in 2023. And it's about 12 or 13, maybe 14 paintings. They're 9 by 12 inches on canvas sheets done with acrylics. And as you can see, they're all black and white. And what I did was essentially try to copy photographs of ruins that I encountered on the internet. So I found an image, I made a copy on the Xerox, and then I used that to create these images. And on the one hand, they're intended to show the devastation. And on the other hand, there's a certain kind of weird aesthetic quality to them. They're like abstractions, aren't they?
Mm.
Now, this one especially is an abstraction. Others are much more concrete. You can see the buildings and the ruins. But the idea behind this was to commemorate or to remember these atrocities that were committed by the Russians.
Yeah, it seems when they happen, for the day or two, or maybe even that week, people are affected by it, and then they move on to the next news item or the next atrocity.
And there are more than enough of them, you know. There's always somebody being killed someplace in the world. And at some point, those things just become as important as Ukraine. To many people, not to everybody, of course.
Yeah. Have you displayed these anywhere, or are they?
I've had 2 showings, one at the Harriman Institute at Columbia University, and another at the Shevchenko Scientific Society. And I'm currently in a discussion with a Toronto-based Ukrainian outfit. They say they want to exhibit this, and now it's a question of when, how, where, and so on. So we'll see. I've also shown them to a Ukrainian art gallery owner in Kiev, and she was very excited, but that's a problem. Maybe after the war.
Yeah, yeah. Amongst being a painter, you also have written several fiction books and poetry books. Is that correct? Like, how many have you
Yes.
written in your career? That aren't just history, but just fiction, sort of staged usually in sort of like the Slavic world, I guess you could say. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, most of them have some kind of Ukrainian theme. It's not necessarily upfront, but it's always there, sometimes in the foreground, sometimes in the background. I've got 11 novels published with small presses, and, they've done moderately well in terms of sales. The last one appeared 2 years ago. Right now, I'm just too busy writing these columns for The Hill and other websites to concern myself with a novel. But I have something in mind. But again, I'm waiting for the war to end, and I suspect that'll be the appropriate time to go back to fiction.
And if someone wanted to read one of your books, what would be the first one you think would be a good one to check out?
Well, I mean, in all honesty, they're all my favorites. So I'd be hard pressed to say this is the best one, this is the only one. But the one that would be probably most fun and most relevant given contemporary events in Ukraine is called Pitoun's Last Stand. I created a character who's the supreme leader of Mother Russia, whose name is Pitoun, P-I-T-U-N. And obviously, we all know who we're really talking about. But the novel concerns itself with a civil war breaks out in Russia, and Russia is on the verge of collapse. So anybody who's rooting for that will probably get a kick out of the novel. And then it obviously gets more complicated. The Pitoun character is planning a comeback. There's a American journalist who's involved. I wish I could show you the book itself, as I was looking through my collection, I noticed I don't have any copies anymore, but it was translated into Polish. And if you read Polish, you could get it. Can you see that? There you go.
There you go. Yeah.
It's translated as the Ostatnia Stacja Pytuna, the last station of Pytun, which is close enough of a translation. Anyway, so you can get it in Polish and practice your Polish. But you could also get the other book, Pytun's Last Stand, on Amazon, as you can all of the other novels that I've written. Just, type in Motyl novels and you'll get a whole bunch of them.
Yeah. You're keeping busy.
I'm keeping busy. What else is there to do?
Yeah. No, it's amazing. Just keep producing, informative and emotional content out into the world. It's not everyone does that. So it's
Well, one
impressive.
tries.
Yeah. You said you also write some poetry and you have a couple poems that you wanted to
Sure.
thought it'd be
Let
cool to
me,
maybe like read them here, towards the end of our conversation today.
okay, gladly. I have a published collection called Vanishing Points that came out about 7 or so years ago. And then I have another collection called Worries, which is supposed to come out maybe next year. We'll see. So I'm going to read 3 poems. They're short from this last collection called Worries. They all deal with war in some way or other. But I'll need to share the screen. So this was written before the war, but it's actually very appropriate today as well. And this is a poem dedicated to the city of Kiev. Once again, it's time to say goodbye to the city on the Boris 10, to produce a sigh or maybe 3 at the sight of the chestnut trees become a memory, destined to be a blurry black and white shot, like they used to make before the war, before the peace, when they'd take a minute or maybe 4 to set up the tripod, to practice the smile, to stand still and wait for the moment to be preserved for eternity and conserved for posterity. On a gently framed piece of hard cardboard that would come to grace a half-empty bed covered with torn lace and gather dust and fade until it would wither and burn in the flames of a shell, smashing walls and jars of pickled garlic that taste best on black peasant bread, smeared with fat, doused with thyme, and downed with homemade pepper moonshine.
Nice.
Thank you. Here's another one. This is shorter. Well, not quite. It's called Trenches. This was written before the war, so this is just generally about war, but again, it's appropriate.
When was it written? Was it written already after 2014 or?
Sometime between 2014 and 2022. I'm not sure exactly when.
Yeah.
All right, so
Yeah.
trenches are no place to tread silently or talk about thrills or contemplate eternity. Mud is no medium for meandering between good and evil or anything in between. Barbed wire is no way to welcome women or winnow the boys from the brave men. The fields between trenches are no better, alas. They repel easy generalizations, insignificant insights, trivial concatenations, talk of the northern lights, movies, restaurants, and sports. The problem is obvious. They're pockmarked with craters full of bones, with no business being where they are, and metal shards with even less business being where they are. Don't get me wrong. Trenches and the fields between trenches have their advantages. They're great for storming bastilles, waving banners, displaying bravery, aspiring to glory, showing off muscles and your agility, rapidity, and ability to sidestep mortality, and the pitfalls of misplaced humanity, or not, as the case might be. And then one more. This was written during the war. I think sometime in 2023. And it's called Ode to Mother Russia. And I'm hoping that your listeners and watchers will get a kick out of this. Taste the cinder, breathe the soot, taste the ashes, lick the boot, touch the entrails, drink the blood, kiss the corpses, greet the flood. Hear the dirges, hear death's knell, hear the weeping, hear church bells. Smell the carnage, smell the guts, sear your hands on burning huts. See the sunset's reddish glow, watch John's horsemen lay her low. We taste, we touch, we hear, we smell, while Mother Russia burns in hell.
Wow. I felt that, as I'm sure many people have. For hanging out today and sharing all your thoughts. I'm definitely going to be looking forward to actually listening to some of this stuff again and editing it down and sharing it with people. I think people interested in Ukraine are gonna get a lot out of this conversation, and all your insights and knowledge that you've accumulated over the years of your study and teaching and being passionate about this part of the world.
Well, let's hope it makes a difference. Anyway, it's been a pleasure. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for having me, and thanks to your listeners. I'm sure there are thousands at the moment, and if not, there soon will be. Thank you for your patience and listening to me.
Well, this is episode 1 of Talking Ukrainian English, but we will be doing more episodes. Next episode will be with Chris and Paul Hennemeyer, who are 2 American brothers who grew up all over the world. And Chris is a senior international aid worker who's worked in Africa and all different places, but he's been in Ukraine the last few years, based in Odessa. And his brother Paul is living in Germany and works in the energy industry as a consultant. And he's consulted in all parts of Europe on energy issues. And he wants to help Ukraine moving forward with their energy industry. And he's also a big supporter of Ukraine and has been over the years. So it's going to be interesting to have a conversation with them. So stay tuned for that and more episodes coming up.
Look out for episode number 2 with guest Chris Hennemeyer, an international aid worker who has been volunteering in Ukraine the last 2 years and founded the organization In the Trenches, where he raises money for Ukrainian troops.
Ставай до бою за свою неземну, ставай до бою, всі молитви тобі, ставай до бою, брами неба озвуться громом і вогнем, громом і вогнем, розбудим, поведем, до сонця вознесем.